Following the logic of this analysis will lead us to a sensitive social topic. My point is not to make moral or ethical judgments, nor am I expressing personal views. Rather, I follow the reasoning of my topic to its rational and logical conclusion, in order to bring awareness to weaknesses of language that have arisen in our culture. My aim in doing this is to then work toward creating and sustaining stronger and more cohesive structures of language. So let's get into it. Today we are continuing to explore what makes definitions work by using the philosophy of language. Part 1 discussed the basics of what makes a definition good and useful, as well as covers a few basic fallacies of language. Here I will be focusing on another major fallacy of language and interpreting it within the context of our social culture. The goal of this talk, same as before, is to bring more awareness to the importance of how words are used and understood person to person. I promote deeper understanding of this issue in order to help others engage in critical thinking about the way they participate in the world through language. So let's begin. What is a tautology? A tautology is a philosophical, logical, and linguistic concept that has different applications in each field. The most common type of tautology you'll hear about is logical tautology. Logically, a tautology is a statement which is always true, usually in the form of A or not A, blank or not blank. For example, the statement, "You're either lying or you're not." This is in essence a useless statement because it can't be false. It's either one or the other, and it is true in all circumstances, so it has no practical use in an argument or analysis. We are also concerned today with the linguistic definition of tautology. A tautology of language is essentially a phrase saying the same thing twice for no reason, or saying the same thing twice as if you were saying something different. An example would be morning sunrise. Well, there's no reason to say morning because by definition, sunrises only happen in the morning. It can also be a definition that defines a word by using the word itself. A definition like this also counts as a circular definition, but there are definitions that can both be circular and tautologies, thus making the definition or word doubly non-functional. To understand how a language tautology works and how it endangers language, let's start with an example. Suppose we have a new word in the language, saplogen. The definition of a saplogen is as follows. Anyone who identifies as a saplogen is a saplogen. Now, a definition like this is called a circular definition because the word being defined is referenced in the definition. It's called circular because in defining the word, we go around in a loop. What is a saplogen? Anyone who says they are a saplogen. And what is the person being? A saplogen. And what's a saplogen? And so on and so forth. We always end up where we start, with no real idea of what a saplogen is. So, what's wrong with a definition like this? Well, say we have a town of saplogens. What do saplogens look like? What do they act like? What makes all the people of the town saplogens, besides the fact that they all claim to be saplogens? Because of our definition, the only thing that these people have in common actually is the fact that they all call themselves by a certain name. The definition we have offers no other unifying characteristics or aspects that distinguish a saplogen from a non-saplogen, except the action of naming oneself a saplogen. So what's the point of being one? Remember that a definition's job is to both include and exclude. This is how we humans understand our world, by creating categories and organizing things in reality. With this definition, we're no closer to understanding what saplogen means than when we started. It remains a weird made-up concept with no meaning or use whatsoever. Yes, the word does include and exclude things. The world is divided into people who are saplogens and people who aren't. But what meaning does that have to us? What real impact does it make, whether someone is a saplogen or not? The lack of criteria for what is and is not a saplogen makes the word so broad, it essentially has no function as a word, except to be used as an example. It neither includes nor excludes sufficiently to be a usable word. This is the fallacy also of being too loose of a definition. With a word like this, it's easy to see how it has no bearing on how we live or communicate, because it doesn't fulfill a definition's main functions. In practice, it would be better to call this a non-definition rather than a definition, because it is not really defining anything at all. A person is, quite literally, speaking nonsense. Now, this is where tautology comes in. It is my claim that a definition of this kind, X is anything that identifies as X, is not only a circular definition and a linguistic tautology, but also a logical tautology. Let's test this out on a real concept that follows the form of X is anything that identifies as X. In the past, we used a common definition for the word woman, which was an adult female human being with certain DNA and biological characteristics. But this definition is quickly changing to a different one, as words often do change in culture through time. So instead of that previous one, we now have a new definition of woman that a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. This is our starting point. Similar to the made-up saplogen example, this word is in the form of an identity definition, and it is a circular definition because the word we are defining is also present in the definition. But is this kind of definition also a tautology? In order to determine whether this definition is a tautology, we must put it to the test. Remember that a logical tautology is a logical statement which is always true. We must ask, can the statement, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, be false if our definition of woman is someone who identifies as a woman? That is our goal, to see if this can be proven false. For this definition to be false, we would have to find someone who is a woman but does not identify as a woman. But by definition, this is impossible because the only people who are women have to identify as women. So if the person did not identify as a woman, then they are not a woman, which means that the statement, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, can only be true given the premises of our proof, thus making it a tautology. So, what does this mean for us going forward? Why does it matter whether the new definition of a woman is a tautology or not? Well, we know that fallacies of definition are not good things and that they have negative consequences for our language, and we try to avoid them. The same with logical tautologies. They are not logical or workable in our language, and so we point them out and try not to use them. But why? What's the problem with this alternate definition of woman? Now we will get into the more philosophical implications of this language, rather than the linguistic ones. It is one thing for a nonsense word like saplogen to be a tautology, because it has no use to us or bearing on the value of our language. But it is another thing for a crucial essential term, such as woman or man, to suddenly become a weak link in the chain of language. The concept of man and woman, in whatever language, have been foundational building blocks throughout history in how we understand each other as humans. They are pillars of meaning that have deep and complex effects on a person's experience of life. For a pillar such as this to shake and shift is to set off a whole ripple effect of doubt, loss of meaning, confusion, and miscommunication, both individually and person to person. There is a great danger in altering the definition of woman or man to the tautology of X is anyone who identifies as X. It essentially constitutes an erasure of the word in question. The identity definition is problematic because it actually offers no definition. It actually renders a word useless and strips the word of its shared social meaning and function. If we have essentially no criteria for what is a woman except what people call themselves, then when we call ourselves women, it becomes as senseless and empty as calling yourself a saplogen. And the danger of this is that it may spread to other concepts or words, thus further undermining our entire shared language system as a whole, and spreading the breakdown of language like a disease. Now keep in mind, there is nothing wrong with the definition of a word changing through history. Countless words have done and continue to add new definitions, lose old definitions, and shift. Remember that it is just as dangerous for a definition to become too loose as it is for one to become too tight. But because this kind of definition is so broad, it essentially has no function as a word. It neither includes nor excludes sufficiently to be a usable word, the fallacy of being too loose of a definition. That is, this definition is not really a definition at all. We must keep in mind that it is the purpose of language to describe, orient, and connect us to reality and to each other. Language does not have the power to alter the real world as we find it, but rather to describe and organize the world in order to be understandable and meaningful to us humans as we live. Language is meant to align with the real world. And when our language fails to align with the real world, it is up to us to alter the language to reflect reality and not the other way around. Which is why it is so important to point out faulty definitions when we find them, and then to form better ones. Now that we are aware that words use definitions of the form X is anyone or thing that identifies as X are logical and linguistic tautologies, we are in a position to move away from this kind of problematic use of language and move toward a better kind of understanding. There are ways each of us individually can weaken linguistic fallacies, such as simply being educated and not participating in the fallacy, and educating others to do the same. Once enough people catch on to avoiding this dangerous kind of definition, we come closer to the definition not being used anymore, that is, becoming obsolete and losing its power over us. Gradually, through constructive conversation, we can reach better functioning definitions of concepts like woman and saplegent. Maybe even one day we'll know what a saplegent is.